Welcome. Today topic is Angular lifecycle hooks. A component have a lifecycle managed by Angular. To load the components onto the page, that Angular creates the component and renders it, and creates the child component and renders it, and also the Angular detects the change in the data bound properties and destroys the component when it removed from the DOM element. So these are the key lifecycle events that occurs that Angular framework triggers when to load the components view onto the page. Angular framework offers the lifecycle hooks and that provides the visibility into these key lifecycle movements and the ability to act on it when that event occurs. Let's see that the lifecycle of a component when to load onto the page. So that is first instantiate the main component and child components and load the static content of main component and child components view and sets the bound properties of main component with initial value. So once this event of initialization event is completed and it calls the lifecycle hook method ng on initiate. So this if component is implemented this ng on initiate, so Angular framework calls this ng on initiate method. In that method we gets the data from the server and sets onto the view. So the when the data is set onto the view and there is a change in the that bound properties values. So this change is detected by on data change event. On the data change event, the call Angular framework calls change detector algorithm to look for change in bound properties values. It signs the properties which has the values are changed and that it sets the views which has reference to that data bound properties. So normally in DOM, in the view have a DOM elements and more than one view has a reference, more than one DOM element has a reference to the one data bound property so that it finds the associated DOM elements and sets the data onto the DOM elements. That is, the fully initialize the content of the main component view, then Angular calls ng after content initiated. So ng do check. So that is the and before that and ng do check if component implements the ng do check and we we provide the custom change detector algorithm. So Angular by default change calls the change detector algorithm to look for the change in bound properties. If we want to provide the custom change detector algorithm and we implement the method ng do check, then once the change detector algorithm checks all the content of the main component, it calls ng after content check. So that is ng after content initiated and ng on initiated both only call once and that only during instantiation of that component. Once the content of the components we set onto the page, then if there is any change on the data bound properties by by entering the user enters the data onto the page or underlying data is changed, when change is detected it calls out ng after content check. So it doesn't call whenever there is a change in the data, it doesn't call that ng after content initiated. After ng do check it calls immediately ng after content check. It doesn't call ng on initiate and ng off content initiated, only called once. When there is a change in the data, it calls ng do check and once the content is checked and entire content of the main component checked, it calls ng after content check. So life cycle hooks is called sequentially: ng on initiated, ng do check, and ng after content initiated, and ng after content checked. So once view is the data content of the data is content of the view is sets on the view, if there is any change detected, it calls ng do check and ng after content checked. Same process of life cycle hooks will be called, callback methods will be called by Angular framework for the child components also. The main component pass the values to the child component. So first it sets the input properties of that child component. So when there is a change in the input properties, it calls the callback method ng on changes. ng on changes, the Angular framework provides the all properties with the old and new values, so that we can check the old and new values, and we can have a necessary application logic. And then it calls ng on initiate, and this sets the business data onto the view. So once set the business data onto the view, there is a change in the bounded properties, and it calls a change detector, default change detector algorithm. So Angular frameworks calls that ng do check. So after ng do check, the same thing, and first time it calls ng after content initiated. So when there is a change in the data afterwards, if there is any change in the data, it calls ng after content checked. So it is same life cycle for all the child components in the components view. So it does first, it does for the main components div elements, and then it does for the all child components. Once the process is completed for all the child component, that the 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 view the components view is fully initialized, so it calls after view initiated. So after view initiated, only called once during instantiation of that component. So when there is change in the data bound properties, it calls that affected components callback method, that is ng do check, and immediately ng after content check. Then it calls after view checked. So these are the life cycle hooks. ng on initiate, it is called of initialization of all data bound properties of a directive. ng do check, it calls after change detector algorithm looks for change in the bound properties of values. So ng do check, if it is implemented by the component, it calls that ng do check to provide the custom change detector algorithm. Then it calls ng after content initiated. So once the change detector sets the properties on that the view, so that is the view is completed initialization of all directive content, all directives content, and it invokes only once when directive is instantiated. So is there, please note that so the components itself is a directive with a view. So directives are components. So this life cycle for both components and directives. So then when there is a detected change, and there is, it calls ng do check and then ng after content checked. So life cycle is called after default change detector has completed checking all the content of the directive. So then the components view after view initiated and after view check, that is life cycle is called after Angular has fully initialized the components view including child component. Then once the lifecycle is called after default change detector has completed checking all content of the components view. So this is the life cycle of hooks is provided by the Angular framework, that is ng on initiate, ng. This is the life cycle hooks provided by the Angular framework, that is ng on initiate, ng do check, ng after content initiated, ng after content checked, and then child component same life cycle except that ng on changes, and then ng on initiate, ng do check, ng after content initiated, and ng after content checked. So once it is finished all initialization of all the components and sets the fully initialize the view, views components view, it calls the ng after view initiated and then ng after view checked. Now the component view fully loads onto the page and displays the data. Now if there is any change after it's loading the page, if there is any change in the bound properties, the change may be by entering the user enters the data onto the input fields, or there is underlying data is changed so that it sets the properties of components is changed. In that event, that change data change event, it calls that components whichever that has impact on which child component, that components ng do check and ng after content checked, then it calls ng after view checked. So this is all about Angular lifecycle hooks. Thank you.